Hello, everybody. Welcome. So delighted to have you all here. My name is Suzanne Goldberg. I'm Executive Vice President for University Life, and I'm really so happy to see everyone today for a very important conversation, Awakening Our Democracy, the Legacy of Slavery on Public Health. This is a campus conversation about the lasting impacts that slavery and enslavement of people has left in the United States. We have an amazing group to talk with today, and I'll introduce them in a moment. First, I just want to remind you that University Life hosts conversations throughout the year on pressing issues, on challenging issues, and on important issues. These are opportunities for everybody from all of the schools across the university, students, faculty, and staff, to come together as a community, to think together, to learn, to listen to each other, and really dig in on what are some of the most important issues of our time. University Life is also your hub for university-level student resources, student life, university events council, life events council events. If you don't already have the University Life app, you should download it because you'll have lots of easy access information in there. And also, you can always find more information about all of the things we're doing at University Life on our website. Today's conversation is part of our flagship Awakening Our Democracy series, which focuses on disparities and justice. It is also part of a broader project both at Columbia and across the United States to think about, reflect on, and work in connection with the legacy of 1619. In August of 1619, the first ship carrying enslaved Africans arrived in North America, in the North American British colony of Jamestown, Virginia, now Virginia. This one event has profoundly shaped U.S. history, and of course, as everybody here knows, has profoundly shaped not only our past, but also how we think, but also our current experiences politically, socially, and with respect to health, both individually and public health. Through today's discussion and many resources that you can find on University Life's Legacies of 1619 webpage, where you'll also find other events, we will focus on, we pay special attention to the links among the reality of enslavement that shattered people's lives, the nation's founding doctrines that enshrine the most basic rights of individuals, yet leave us with tremendous inequities rooted in the institutions that we hold, many of us hold dear, and how all of this affects our lives individually and collectively today and going forward. So the goal of these gatherings, including today's conversation, is to open to new conversations, to rethink familiar perspectives, and contribute to a more complete telling of the American story. Today's conversation will focus especially on the ways in which enslavement and its legacies have impacted health outcomes for communities of color. You don't have to go far. I know many of you, although not all of you, are from the Medical Center campus. I think we have a group from the Morningside campus as well, and want to welcome everybody who came uptown for this. But you don't have to go far to find data showing really profound and stunning health disparities related to race and related to ethnicity in the United States, whether we're talking about life expectancy or prevalence of disease, whether we're talking about asthma or cardiac disease or obesity or diabetes or any number of other diseases. We look at the research, health research. We look at the access to care. We look at access to health insurance. We look at access to providers and experiences in these settings, all of which will come up in our conversation today. So I want to turn and introduce our conversation partners. We have I'll just go on the order of my list. So Professor Geraldine Downey is the Robert Johnston Niven Professor of Humane Letters and Psychology and the Director of Columbia Center for Justice, which has as its mission to help transform a criminal justice system from one that is driven by punishment and retribution to one that is centered on prevention and healing. Dr. Downey has worked on and taught about issues related to incarceration since the 1970s and has taught over many years in prison college programs in New York and maybe elsewhere too, including in Sing Sing, Bedford Hills, and the Taconic Correction Facility. She has held numerous important administrative roles at Columbia, and her work on the causes and consequences of social exclusion and rejection has been recognized through awards, substantial grant funding, and more. And she's currently studying how identities of hope, such as a student identity, can transform the narrative about people deemed rejectable, people with a criminal conviction. Samuel Roberts is an associate professor of history, associate professor of socio-medical sciences, associate professor of African American studies, the former director of the Institute for Research in African American Studies, and Dr. Roberts also played a critical role in transforming that institute into Columbia's newest department of African American and African Diaspora Studies. He writes, teaches, and lectures widely in African American history, medical and public health history, urban history, issues of policing and criminal justice, and the history of social movements. His book, Infectious Fear, Politics, Disease, and the Health Effects of Segregation, addresses the historical and continuing links between legal and de facto segregation and poor health outcomes. His current project explores the social and political evolution of drug addiction rehab, quote, rehabilitation from the beginning of the post-war heroin epidemic through the 1990s. He's published his research relating to this project in Social History of Alcohol and Drugs and elsewhere, and he's also the co-editor of the Race, Inequality, and Health book series of Columbia University Press. Courtney Cogburn is the associate professor at the Columbia School of Social Work, where she employs a transdisciplinary approach to examining the role of racism in the production of racial inequalities in health. She too serves in many roles in Columbia and elsewhere and has received funding for her work from the National Institutes of Health, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and others. Dr. Cogburn's work focuses on the ways in which we characterize and measure racism, including cultural racism in the media, and the effects of racism on racial inequalities in health. She is also developing a project using data science to explore the link between media-based racism and population health, and is the lead creator of the 1,000 Cut Journey, an immersive virtual reality experience that was developed in collaboration with the Virtual Human Interaction Lab at Stanford and premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival in 2018. So you may be the only one of us in this group who had a premiere at the Tribeca Film Festival so far. So let me just say a word about the format, and then we'll jump into the conversation. We will talk, or mostly my colleagues here will talk about the issues on tap for today. And then in about a half an hour, I'll ask you to get ready to raise questions or comments. And what we'll do is turn to you in groups, to the students in the room, in particular in groups of 3. And I'll just ask you to say your name, your school, and pose your question. So with that, I want to thank you for being here. And I want to thank all of you again for being here. And let me start with a question that's both big and small, and ask you to share, when we think about the legacy of slavery on public health, sort of what's a big picture perspective that you think people ought to be aware of? What is the legacy of slavery? I mean, it's many things, but what is one view of the legacy of slavery on public health? And if you could also offer us something specific, sort of a concrete illustration or example of this legacy, and maybe we can just go down the row and start with you, Samuel.
Me or
Starting as you like.
I'm trying to pass along.
The direction with it. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for Suzanne for organizing this, and for the series in general, of which this is a part. It's been an immense contribution to our campus. We're going on, what was it, 3 years now?
Almost 5.
Almost, okay, all right. Clearly I might have missed a few, but congratulations on 5 years. It's been fantastic, and I'm really happy to be part of this. I'm a historian, as Suzanne mentioned, And I'm often conflicted about questions like this. What is the legacy of slavery? Because on one hand, clearly there are legacies, right? They're in our politics. They're in, they're clearly in our built environment. I mean, so many of our buildings in this country, including the White House itself, was built by enslaved labor. It's in our economic history. This country wouldn't have existed without forced servitude. But then there's other things that I look at today and I say, I don't know if that's really a legacy of slavery. That might be a legacy of something that happened 5 years ago. That sometimes we impute to slavery this kind of half-life, like it's some sort of like radioactive isotope that we're just waiting maybe in 1 billion years. I don't know how long it takes an isotope to lose its radioactivity, by the way, so that's a broad guess. If anyone's like tweeting and fact checks me on that, I don't know what to tell you. It's not really my gig. But however long it takes for that to happen, and I'm not sure that's quite, I could easily imagine counter-historically, had, say, the period of Reconstruction worked out the way it was envisioned by, Black Republicans in the South and, radical Republicans based in Boston and, throughout the North, that, we could have made up a lot of ground within a generation or so. What we have today is, in many ways, a legacy of policies that, some as recent as the 1970s and 80s, and with mass incarceration, the 80s and 90s. So it's this is why you shouldn't have asked me to be the first one, because I don't want to derail the question, but I also want to call attention to other things. So I would say in terms of that said, one thing that I'm pretty sure has some sort of historical basis in slavery is clearly our ideology of race. And I don't mean our conception of race itself, but the ideology of race, which is to say how it works in our politics, the work that race does, and how we formulate, enact, and enact public policy. There's an ideology of race that always sets Black people up as having to prove their citizenship, their worthiness for citizenship. It could be, and this isn't just about conservative versus liberal. I mean, this is on both, I was about to say both sides of the aisle, which is trite and also inaccurate in this case, but certainly in many approaches. You might think of, for example, the Moynihan Report from about 50 years ago or so, in which it was a liberal consensus.
Say what that is. Say what that is.
I'm sorry, yeah.
Then I will move it over to ask Geraldine.
I went from audience speaking to having a one-on-one with my good friend and colleague, Suzanne, where we just start vibing over a cup of coffee, and I clearly forgot that's not what we're doing here. The Moynihan Report was this report that was published in a Democratic administration in 1965. Dan Patrick Moynihan was worked in the Secretary of Labor's office, and he made this argument that what Black people needed was, basically jobs programs, education programs, things that eventually came under this basket called affirmative action. And his rationale was that slavery had destroyed the Black family, had turned Black families into matriarchal, just baskets of dysfunction. And it had so much staying power in liberal and conservative politics. And it took Black social scientists and Black political figures years and decades to just argue that this was, the most racist drivel that was supposed to be for a good cause. And so I think that's the kind of legacy that we still live with, because there's still this assumption that slavery is what the problem was. It's like, no, actually, maybe it might have been what America did 5 years ago or 5 weeks ago. And then you said a specific, I would say for the work that I do, a clear one is drug policy. We meaning Black people, are always assumed to be unfit for citizenship. And part of the fitness for citizenship is sobriety, industriousness. So it's just, in that logic, it always makes sense to hyper-police Black communities. Because they're always if they're not, all those stigmatizing words we say about drug use, if they're not that, they're on their way to becoming that. So let's just be preemptive and flood the place with cops and jails.
Thank you so much, Samuel. And I think, as I suspect we'll see throughout the conversation, that would be hard, if not impossible, to separate questions of history, of politics, of the Moynihan Report, I think, is a great example, from questions of how we think about health science, right? These are not, they don't exist out of relation to each other. Each exists and informs the other, including the way we think about, do research on, fund issues related to health. So Geraldine, let me turn to you, and then after you, we'll go over to Courtney.
So I agree with everything that Sam has said. From my particular perspective, as somebody who goes in to the prisons and teaches there the same classes that I teach at Columbia, one of the most stark, as I sort of feel it, as a legacy of slavery with all these intervening variables, is that when I teach at Columbia, it's to primarily white students. When I go into the classroom at Sing Sing or in the women's facilities, or I also teach at Queensborough Correctional Facility and Rikers, primarily the students are African American, or they're brown people from whose families have moved relatively recently from South or Central America. And so what is most stark is that the students, in terms of their quality, in terms of their ability to think through the most challenging issues of today, the students who are incarcerated have a kind of a wealth of understanding, both in terms of their history and the history of where they've come from, of why they're incarcerated, and the sort of flip side of incarceration is public health, and they're in there if you follow them through their lives and the lives of their parents or grandparents, in part because the systems that are put in place by people like Moynihan, and they're political systems that decide what happened to people who engage in challenging behaviors, or communities that engage in challenging the system in ways that are not acceptable to the system. So what they know is how to solve the problem. They also know that they're not in, and their family members or members of their community have never been in the positions where they get to decide how challenges are changed or dealt with. And what one of my students, Jay Holder, what he said about Columbia, as he's here now as a graduate student, but as he was sitting in a classroom in Columbia, he said, what are you teaching the students at Columbia about people like us? You are teaching at Columbia people who are going to be in positions of power, and and how are you teaching them to make this society a better place, and to find ways to include people like us, and to find a way to include us in a public health system, in an education system that gets us to Columbia without having to do it through Sing Sing. So what I'm saying here is that, I think that the sort of a legacy of slavery, which is still in the 13th Amendment, is that if you are effectively a slave, if you're convicted of a felony, is that it's not just being excluded and treated by a system that's punitive and retributive for the challenges that you show, especially as an adolescent, but it's also being excluded from the positions from positions of power, and to be able to decide how society's challenges are dealt with. And I would say that that's one of the biggest problems with the Moynihan Report, is that it's a report about a community from somebody who's totally outside of that community. It would not happen, and that is a legacy of slavery.
So clearly we can talk about this the whole time, right? Just answering this one question. But what I'll add, I want to second the idea that part of the legacy of slavery is how it shaped our racial ideologies. And part of that ideology is the avoidance of talking about race, racism, the effects of slavery on our current society. And so, and that has been part of what has us in this place of even having to have this conversation that I think certainly plays a significant role. And then I think if we think about social determinants of health, and think about things that are not just proximal to health outcomes, but all the many social, cultural, et cetera, factors that contribute to health, and then link that to legacies of slavery, it becomes more obvious as well. One piece I don't hear people talking about quite enough, particularly in relation to health, is historical trauma and intergenerational trauma, and how the legacy of slavery is actually in some ways carried in the bodies of Black people living here today. And that is tricky, right? That's one thing to conceptualize that, and it's another thing to try and measure that and the effects of that. So I think sometimes it kind of lingers in conceptual territory and doesn't quite translate into empirical work. But I think we need to be thinking about that more in terms of what are the physical representations of enslaved people that we still carry today.
So I want to follow up with you on that and just share a data point that may be familiar to folks in this room. It actually comes from a friend of mine, Linda Villarosa, who wrote a piece as part of the New York Times 1619 project, which if you haven't taken a look at, really want to encourage you, just go on the New York Times website and look at that project. There's a very wide range of articles. There's analytic articles. You can also find art, poetry, photography. But one of the podcasts. And more is, great podcast, actually, including one particularly on public health called Bad Blood, which maybe one of you will talk about. But one of the things that Linda shared in her article and that she shared in other settings is a 2016 survey of medical students who were asked to consider how do people experience pain? And the question was, if your patient gets their hand, I'm paraphrasing, also not an expert in this, if your patient gets their hand slammed in a car door, how much pain will they experience? Something like that. And that students overall thought that African American patients would experience less pain than white patients. That was the comparison. That's in 2016. And so when we ask, well, why would that be? It's hard for me, as I think about that question, to de-link the answer entirely from the historical trauma. So maybe can you talk a little bit about this idea of measuring and how you think about measuring the historical trauma in people?
Yeah, I think the piece that you're tapping into, me, sort of fits under that ideology umbrella, right? So this legacy of dehumanizing Black bodies, and we've never honestly grappled with the ways that we did that in order to keep slavery going, right? If you thought these were actual human beings, you probably wouldn't have been able to maintain that very long. So this action of dehumanizing bodies have continued today in the language that we use, right? So you have to envision a Black body as being less human in order to think that a Black body experiences less pain. And I'm not sure those medical students would consciously describe that that's what they were doing or saying, but you could kind of, I would argue, unpack that that's part of what's going on. And that is a racial ideology. Part of what I was talking about in terms of those physical characteristics are, what we're understanding about epigenetics, for instance, the ways we're thinking about gene expression and how gene expression reacts to the environment and how that sort of carries along. Risk for disease, all these sorts of things. And then the legacies of our medical institutions and how they're also grounded oftentimes in the dehumanization of Black bodies. And so I think in terms of that transference that happens across the board. I also have a student who's thinking about historical trauma in a very multidimensional way and is also thinking about it as economic, right? So, and putting it on economic inequalities and how that has roots in slavery as a trauma in and of itself, as well as psychological trauma in addition to physical trauma.
And actually, as you're talking, I'm thinking a lot about complexity theory. I imagine some of you have read about this and some of you may not have yet. It's the kind of thing where you can go on the web and Google complexity theory and find one of those videos that with cartoon figures walks you through the basics of it. But I think the point really drawing from all three of you is that there is no one answer to the big question, to go back to what you were saying, and that there is a lot that we have to find ways to hold in our minds at the same time if we are going to think critically and thoughtfully and proactively about what it means to think about race, and in particular African American health, individual and public health in the context of the US today. So Geraldine, let me go back to you with this question. You're in prison a lot. You see the healthcare system, and at least maybe not direct since you're in the classroom more than in other settings. But you see just to pick up on Courtney's point about seeing people as human, you see the ways in which people who are incarcerated are treated as more or less human in different settings. And of course, as people know here, people of color, and in particular African Americans, are disproportionately incarcerated in this country. So how do you see this playing out where you spend time?
So I asked the members of my team who've come home from prison about what I should say in relation to this, and I think that I want to kind of connect to to Courtney's point about trauma. If they were to say that what doesn't get dealt with, or what is the issue that they face in prison, among of the many terrible things that you face in prison, but it is coming in with trauma and being in an environment of what they have termed persistent traumatic stress. And that what I think you're talking about is that part of what trauma is, it's consistent stress. You're living, your body is activated in ways that are unhealthy in the long run. And so I don't think it's sort of so much in prison an issue of good care versus bad care, because the care is not great. But it is the environment itself that in some ways mirrors the environments that people who end up incarcerated have come from. They've lived their lives in a space of trauma, and that this is unhealthy. And so, I mean, we had a conversation. I work with a group of what are called justice ambassadors. The half of them are young people, most of whom have been involved with the criminal justice system, and half are from city agencies who deal with vulnerable children. And last night we had a conversation about this, about the trauma, the levels of trauma that they experience. And so if you're thinking about adverse childhood experiences, which we all know there's 11 that you're supposed to have, in the prison classroom, the average is at least 4. Or so most people
Can you just say, I think probably a lot of people here know what you mean by adverse childhood experiences, but maybe not everybody.
It's 11 experiences that are considered traumatic, and these are ones that have been identified as having significant long-term health problems, like abuse, exposure to parental substance disorder, mental illness, and one of them is having a parent in prison. And so the more you have, the worse your health is. That's kind of the bottom line on it. Most people have one, but very few people, except people who end up incarcerated or from communities that have large numbers of people going to prison, have 4 or more. And so this is the kind of one of the ways in which trauma is intergenerational, because you're talking about traumas in the parents' generation going down into the children's generation, and so it is one of the big issues in public health. How are you going to deal with this before somebody acts out in ways that leads them to prison? And that's what I was told to say.
And just quickly to add to that, ideologically, we tend to frame those problems as failures of the Black family, as opposed to how that lies in systems of oppression and legacies of oppression, right? So that's even the framing of that problem has roots in slavery.
And as I understand it from what I read, and again, I don't have the expertise that many of you do have in this room, there's the issue of people who African Americans and others, members of many vulnerable communities who think it's our fault, right? It's my fault, it's my family's fault, it's my neighbor's fault. And so there's a very complex cycle of self-blame, of external blame that raises many questions. And I see we need to pause for a second, probably to...
And Courtney, if you could actually hold the mics in front of your mouth, because we're having a hard time hearing you in the back. The two with the handheld are fine, but if you could...
Okay.
The actual mic hold is...
Just the...
Oh,
That.
sorry. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. And so,
Obviously, I
Samuel, let me come back to you with this question, because I think, Courtney makes the excellent point that trauma can be intergenerational. And when we think about tracing both back to the time of enslavement, but also as you were talking about the sort of rupture post-slavery, where there was, a plan for reconstruction that was immediately ended after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated and Andrew Johnson became our president. Gone through generations, and without having gone through the kind of sort of a version of the truth and reconciliation process that other countries have gone through in the wake of a major national trauma. Not to suggest that that addresses every issue, but we haven't even taken anything up on along those lines. So here's what I wanted to ask you. So you wrote this book, Infectious Fear, Politics, Disease, and the Health Effects of Segregation, that seems to shed light on a lot of what we're talking about here, the ways in which external conditions that sometimes are policy-driven or law-driven can impact people's ideas about disease and also people's experience of it. So can you add in, can you weigh in here?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, one of the arguments that I make about this period, which is, say, the period of Jim Crow, late 19th century to mid-20th century, is an encouragement for all of us to think of our system and our ideology of race is also being deeply imbricated in our economic regimes of inequality. Slavery produced a racial ideology in that it rationalized a labor regime of one of forced labor and brutality. But I think we should be very clear as well that you don't physically and forcibly transplant 9 to 12 million people just because you think they're inferior. It's very expensive to do that, and unless you're getting profit from it, that's not a venture that an entire civilization is going to do. And so in that sense, race becomes almost epiphenomenal of, an early form of Western, meaning Western hemispheric capital. All right, so we should just be clear about that. All that is to say is that those are regimes that we still have with us in different forms. We expropriate excess value and labor from people routinely all the time. And segregation, residential segregation, is an excellent way of doing that. If you force everyone to live in one area, then you can charge them whatever you want for rent, which is what we had for so much of this period. And even till today, there are so many ways in which we put poor taxes. They're informal. They're not labeled a poor tax because that's unconstitutional, but that doesn't matter. We have so many ways that we tax poor people, particularly poor people of color. And it's a way of gaining profit for everybody in the system except the people who were most victimized. Today, in slavery, it was obviously the expropriation of labor. It's like, I will force you to work until almost to the point where you die. And if it's cheaper to get a new slave, then I will let you die. But until then, I'm just gonna keep working you. Today, it's, check cashing places. It's, people who have a criminal record who can't get a job and then who have to be paid under the books or under the table for, less than minimum wage. All that, while you're inside, all the commissary fees, all of those things. There's a great panel downtown, by the way, the Community Service Society of New York, and we're gonna have one of our panelists works for Fees and Fines for Justice. I'm probably misrepresenting that because I don't think fees and fines are for justice, but those are the proper words. And she'll explain all about that. So I think there's ways in which that all of these regimes of money-making, of profit-taking, are also part of this racial ideology. So that is that part of the legacy of slavery, but also it's a legacy of how capitalism reinvents itself generation after generation, even in 2019. So in the early 20th century, we saw bad health conditions in African American populations due to lung infections because they had bad housing. Maternal and infant mortality was much higher amongst Black Americans because the sanitary services weren't as good. Healthcare services weren't as good. It goes on and on and on. Just sheer accidents, something as pedestrian as, you don't think of that, when I'm a historian, when you think of writing, you want to find something exciting, right? When you write a book, you want to do your research and all that. And then you find out that so many people died of something as pedestrian as just bad safety because no one actually cared about how they lived or where they lived or whatever. So I think that's all part of the regime. And that's the legacy of 1619, but it's also a legacy of, post-1970 as well, yeah.
And in our conversations about health, we talk about social determinants of health, and we don't talk about all of that and how that's related to social determinants and how it's affecting our observations of racial disparities. And then not racial disparities, but racial inequities in health, right? So we're not talking about all these economic systems, all these levels of disadvantage, and we'll still look at differences in health among Blacks and whites, and we'll go to, what Black people need to do? They need to eat better and exercise. And then we'll have a whole separate conversation about social determinants of health and not meaningfully integrate these issues. We'll even avoid the word racism in talking about health disparities, right? And we keep describing differences across groups. So there's a ways in which this is obvious, right? In some ways, having to have this conversation is a little bit absurd. Like, of course, there's a legacy that has implications for health, but there's such a resistance to acknowledging and accepting that in our discourse that we have to have a whole panel, right? Talking about multiple series, trying to demonstrate to people about how the math adds up. And it's just incredibly frustrating how, in one breath, oh, sure, racism, and sure, legacies of oppression, but we're talking about, you need to eat better on this side, on the health side. Yeah, it's a little ridiculous.
And so I have a question for all of you directly related to this, and just a heads up that in a handful of minutes we'll come back, in 5 minutes exactly, I'm going to come out to all of you for questions and comments. But I just Googled to try to find some recent data, and I Googled health disparities in New York City, and what popped up, I'm sure there's something more recent, but this was a 2010 fact sheet that showed life expectancy for African Americans in New York City, wealthy and poor, was much less. I don't have that number offhand, but it, many years less than it was for white people in New York City in 2010. So when we think about all of what you've just said, this all seems fairly intractable, right? Courtney, you've just made the point, why are we having these conversations? And, in a sense...
I don't know why we're having them. I just think we should have them.
Yeah, no, I take it, right? I mean, what signs, if any, do any of you see for change, for growth, for transformation, even small windows in? Is there technology? Is there innovation that you're seeing? Is there, obviously a lot has changed also in recent decades. We are asking new questions. Studies are being funded differently. But are you seeing any windows toward any kind of change? And even if you kind of imagine fast forward in a couple of years, what you might think would be an opening toward change. And I ask this question given the deep roots, historical, social, economic, and otherwise, that have laid the foundation for where we are today. Why don't we go down the row, and then Samuel, start with you, and then, I don't have to start with you. Geraldine, I can start with you this time.
Do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Or over to Courtney. Start with you, and then I'll be coming back out to all of you.
I mean, I think this comes back to this framing question, and it frustrates me because I'm, more and more convinced that we don't actually want to do anything about these problems. We just want to keep talking about the problems and make ourselves feel like we're dealing with the problem. So, for instance, there was a recent call, lots of money going toward using AI to figure out the causes of health disparities. We know the causes of health disparities. We don't need millions of dollars to be spent.
You don't need artificial.
We don't need artificial
intelligence. It doesn't really take a lot. It doesn't take a whole lot of real intelligence to figure it out.
Like just some basic intelligence, right? To just pay attention.
Artificial common sense, maybe.
Artificial common sense would be nice. But I kind of resent in some ways the amount of time I have to spend trying to convince people that racism matters. and that it's not just race doesn't cause disease. Checking a box black doesn't equal disease. We can just check different boxes, right? If that's the case, I'll just start checking white and then all those problems will go away. It's clearly something else that's happening. But people are so resistant to that. We spend so much time trying to demonstrate why these things matter. And part of my work, to your question about technology, part of my work using virtual realities to try and help people understand what you just said, like unpacking all these connections and how these things are related. How did we actually get here? But we could be spending so much more time and money and resources actually doing something about the problems instead of trying to convince the masses that racism is a thing and has implications for health.
And thank you. And as each of you weigh in, one of you who registered for today asked the question, well, how are political divisions contributing to or affecting at all the sort of ongoing disparities that we're talking about? So if you want to sprinkle a little bit of that into your response, Geraldine or Samuel, and then we'll open up.
So what I would say that I'm optimistic about is events like this that are talking about awakening our democracy, because I think the our part is really important. And that you talk about, we know these problems, and you're right, and I think anybody would agree, everybody would agree. But we also know how to find out the solutions, and I see this as something that everybody has to be engaged in, not regardless of whether they're black or brown or like me, an immigrant. And to find a way to move things forward. What I see out in working in the community with young people is that they're like much more willing to become engaged in thinking about these issues from a political point of view and thinking about how they can offer solutions. And that's I think that's the hope of the future. But I think we have to find ways within the academy to promote this and actually to sort of act on it, rather than focusing a lot of funding on areas that we feel like mightn't be the best way to find solutions. And so the political divides currently, I actually believe it's important for people of different points of view to be engaged in the political process. So I applaud people who come, who engage. And it's people who don't, I think, continue to perpetrate the problems.
I echo the sentiments and all that, and would add to that in terms of the question about political divisions. I don't know if the question was referring to the only two parties that we have in this country, but I see the issues being more about divisions between those who have some sort of access to participation and those who don't. And when you look at it that way, neither party really has much investment in expanding the electorate. I mean, clearly you would have hoped that the Democrats would have, but they haven't. They lost a major election in 2000 over, a handful of votes in Florida, and they lost the presidency in 2016 by losing the Electoral College, but they had the majority. For that entire 16 years, never on their platform was the expansion of the suffrage, of the right to vote, to formerly incarcerated people, let alone people who are actively incarcerated, who I would argue are still citizens. Just because you're incarcerated for something doesn't mean you should lose the most, sacrosanct right in the Constitution. They never did that because they always knew that if you expand that electorate, you actually change the political calculus. You might not get a Clinton dynasty if you actually expand that electorate. You might get people who are actually more looking like, AOC, except not in 2016, maybe in 2008 even. So that's the division that I see. I think in terms of awakening the democracy, we also need to expand it as well. And in ways that we have to challenge the way, it's not just about voter reg even. We vote on one day of the year. What happens if I can't get off of work for that day? Most people work in a gig economy, 2 or 3 jobs, sometimes 2 or 3 shifts in a day. They can't do that, or they can't get childcare. We have to radically rethink all of our 19th century notions of what democracy is, and that really means thinking more about who participates. So in terms of the optimism, and I think this is particularly apropos for what I perceive to be a lot of our audience, who are student age, or maybe I'm just feeling my own increasingly accelerating, Asianness.
As you're looking at me.
Yeah, no, sorry, no, not at all. At myself. Any efforts that we do, in a university setting, there's a temptation to see ourselves as saviors, to get a savior complex, and that we are doing things for people. And that has to be rethought as well. It's what we do with people, not that we do for. As long as you see yourself as doing for people, you hold yourself to a standard that you would not, lower than what you would hope other people would hold themselves. That anything you're doing is good enough because anything you do helps. And that's not always the case. We can do a lot of harm from where we are. And that's why it's important that we work with people and not for people.
Well, thank you. And that is a great point at which to open up for questions. And I know somebody's going to take my mic, so I'm going to borrow yours. And so I'll just ask folks to say your name and your school and then raise your question or comment. And just keep it brief enough so that we can get a range of views. We'll take 3 at a time. But as you think about what you might want to ask, I really want to encourage you, if I could just say this directly, not to be intimidated. You can, questions big, small, fancy, basic, really unsure or very sure, those are all welcome. Because I think to go back to the point Geraldine made, in our setting, in an educational setting, we do best when everybody participates. So even if you're not about to raise your hand, at least I would invite you to be thinking about what you would want to ask. And then as you leave here today, talk about these questions and these ideas with your classmates and your colleagues. But I see a question over there. If you don't mind standing up if you're able to, and then just saying your name and your school.
My name is Diane Tucker, and I am actually not affiliated here. But I guess my question comes, I wonder if you see anything encouraging potentially to come from actually conversations around climate change, because what occurs to me is I am so empathetic with the frustration, but the lack of literacy and the way people view things as so segmented, I think is actually a problem about actually pedagogy for a long time, and the incredible way in which things have been left in silos, and and so I think that the people's lack of literacy about complex dynamics, I think that those things are actually being enhanced by these conversations about climate change, where people have a chance to see, oh, X relates to that. And I think that we're still not quite yet there, but I wonder whether perhaps, references to those dynamics among you all, I mean, you know what I mean? There can be helpful interchange as people, because I think that there is energy going into those directions too. I don't know.
Great. Thank you. Let's take 2 more. I see somebody over here.
Hi, thank you so much for putting this together. My name is Ron Nelson, and I'm a first-year med student here. And I find that when I have conversations with people about, I find that when I have conversations with people about police violence, it's very difficult for them to engage in the conversation the way that they should, primarily because they, one, don't necessarily understand the historical context behind the origins of the police force, and 2, they don't really know what life would be like in the absence of a police force. And I don't really study this necessarily, so I'm curious to know if you could maybe give sort of a historical context for how the police force developed in the United States, and then also what are some possible alternatives to a state-based police force in order to maintain public order. Thank you.
And one more.
Hi, I'm Craig Blinderman. I work at the medical center as a clinician. And I guess my question is more clinically related, maybe less so about public health, although we see the disparities. I work in palliative care, so I see a lot of patients at the very end of life, or dealing with pain management or symptom management with a serious illness. And there's clearly major disparities among people of color at the end of life in terms of their outcomes. And there's a thorny issue that has come up, and we had a very extreme example of that in a recent patient that we had cared for, our team had cared for, and members of our team and other caregivers were thought to have murdered a black man in the hospital who died from unfortunate complications of his illness. And the charge of murder and the conversations about how to care for someone when they're disease can no longer be cured, and questions of hospice and end-of-life care to focus on their comfort become very charged. In fact, given the disparities and the history of how healthcare has been or has not been given to African Americans. And so how to navigate that conversation when there's a medical opinion that unfortunately the situation will not improve with more life-sustaining therapies or what have you, and actually make things worse and for the family. And yet there's this challenge of, well, this is not okay. This is what we want and deserve, and so forth. And so how to navigate that very challenging dynamic.
Great. Thank you all. So I'm going to turn over to each of you to weigh in as where you'd like. We have a question on climate change and how it intersects with the issues we've been talking about. Question about policing and law enforcement, and how do we think about that and alternatives? And a question, and your question just now, and I want to give it a slight overlay also, which is a lot of what we have been discussing, or at least particularly toward the end, is thinking about, how do we have these conversations, and how do we have conversations about treatment in individual cases against a backdrop of long histories of discrimination and violence, particularly racially inflected or driven, and where there is suspicion and fear, and some rightly so. And so how do we think about any of these pieces? And I know not everybody here was asked to be an expert on any one of these issues necessarily, but it would be wonderful to have each of your perspectives as you want to weigh in. Courtney, do you want to start?
Sure. I have two quick responses. So related to climate change, I think you're right that it's encouraging more of a system structural level analysis, and that's encouraging. I'm also part of our climate change task force here, not my area of expertise at all. And I'm questioning whether we're really going to grapple with the realities of race and racism in relation to climate change, if we're really going to take on a climate justice lens in talking about that. So sure, we can think about systems and how this affects that, but we can still sort of be race blind in our assessment of those things. And so I'm questioning, like, even how something like residential segregation is now being associated with warmer climates and racially segregated neighborhoods. We're not really doing that level of analysis. I hope we do, but I'm not sure. To the question about the direct care in the individual case, my quick response is, I think we could get into the details of an individual case, but ultimately individual cases add up to a pattern. And at some point, the system has to step back and look at the pattern and see how this emerges. So even if you're able to rationalize how an individual case, I understand that you're Black or a person of color, and that's not what this is about. This is just my best recommendation for you. But at some point, you have to step back and see if you're consistently making that recommendation for certain types of people and families, and more invested in extended care, experimental care, clinical trials, et cetera, for different types of people. So really, it's about an analysis of those patterns.
So with respect to the point that you made about the students being educated in silos and us as faculty operating in silos, I think this was something that Courtney had sort of also brought up, and I had meant to follow up on it, not exactly the way you said it, but this is, I think, a real problem of our education, of our college system, that once students move beyond the first couple of years, they're into majors where they're being prepared for even more specialized professional careers. And so we have a group of students working with us at the Center for Justice who have come up with this idea of something called Frontiers of Justice, where they're offering to go in to especially sort of intro classes and majors to talk about issues of justice in relation to whatever that major is. And I think that that's the kind of, that this is another grassroots effort is required here for students to say, we want something different. We're not going to be the kind of people who are going to be effective, engaged citizens of the world if all we're taught to do is be specialists. And so on, I think it's December 3rd, the Frontiers of Justice are having their first meeting, and they're eager to have opportunities to go in to talk to classes about how students can engage in issues of justice in relation to particular majors. I think that the issue that you brought up about policing, I'm not an expert in the history of policing in the US. I know a lot more about the same issues that have happened in Ireland, and I sort of see that the same thing happens. That if a community has no basis for trusting the police, then they seek justice in other ways, and that can be ultimately harmful for the community and for themselves. It's a real conversation that has to happen. I don't know the answer to it, but I know the absence of any police force can also have its own problems, as it did in Northern Ireland. And I think in relation to the pain, I think how to deal with people at an individual level at the end of life. One of the things that I sort of felt was helpful to me to think about it was my friend and colleague Jennifer Eberhardt, who has written a wonderful book called Bias. She talked about how her father, and she's a black professor at Stanford, needed a liver transplant, and they weren't getting it, and she had to make a decision whether to fight the system because she felt that there was inequities in it, or to engage in the grieving process and the end of life process. She did both, but postponed the fight the system part until her father had passed away. But I think you have to keep those in mind, and we who are, in a sense, giving treatment or in those kind of positions need to be very open to hearing from the community and having them involved in any kind of care decisions. And that's.
So let's get three more quite quick questions, comments, and then now I'm a law professor and I am very comfortable calling on people, but I won't do that in this setting. I see three people, or maybe we have more, several people here. Go ahead. I don't know.
Okay.
Is that you? Sure, and again, your name and your school is great.
Okay. Hi, guys. My name is Melody Gomez. I'm also a first-year medical student. Thank you for spending this time with us. I really appreciate it. I, like Ron, have found myself in difficult rooms to be in and trying to have conversations that need to be had but aren't really being had. So I have a little bit of a big question, and I was wondering if you could change something about a curriculum that's targeted towards the kinds of conversations like these, about social determinants of health or in any sort of like higher education setting like we often find ourselves in, what would you include in that curriculum to produce more productive conversation?
Thank you. I think there are a couple of folks over here. The mic is on its way.
Hi, I'm Kate. I'm in GSAP CCCP program.
Can you just explain the acronyms? Because not everybody might know.
So I know it's kind of complicated. It's the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. I'm in the CCCP program, so it's Critical, Curatorial, and Conceptual Practices in Architectural Studies. I know, it's a very long email signature for me, but I guess one of the big discussions that I think is always lacking within architecture is discussions such as these. I guess in terms of, is there, so much of the discussions have been about changing the social and political environment. Is there a way that direct influences in terms of the built environment that could affect, so whether it's related to prisons or schools or hospitals, that could directly address some of these issues that have been brought up here?
Thank you. And I think there was there one more? Or yes, right next, or somebody right in front of you, actually.
Hi, my name is Catherine Myung. I'm also a first-year med student here, and I was really struck by what was described about how descriptions of public health disparities can actually be kind of hijacked into justifying the racial ideology that's the legacy of slavery. So I was wondering, is there, as someone who's interested in academic public health research, is there a place for that kind of research when we're trying to think about convincing people about the legacy of slavery?
Great, thank you. So given that we only have about we have a handful of minutes, so and clearly I'll just note from the great questions in this round and the previous that there need to be opportunities for more conversations about all of this, but why don't I turn it over to you, Geraldine, or you look like you're got mic up.
No, Sam didn't for Wendy's chance the last time.
I'm sorry, could you rephrase the questions for us, or just give us a refresher? Well,
Change the curriculum.
Right, sure.
the curriculum.
So thinking about the curriculum and what might change to enable more conversations, thinking about the built environment and how that shapes our work in all of these areas, and thinking more broadly about the sort of public health, medical, how do we have these conversations and how do they shape even my add on to yours, the questions we even think about asking.
Right, thank you. I think I may just try 1.5 of those if it's okay. The question about the curriculum and also Ron's earlier question about having that hard conversation about policing. In a lot of ways, those might be in a similar basket in the sense that there's ways on a curricular level that I think we need as instructors and also as people who will always be educating ourselves no matter what field you all go into, that we need to look beyond our own discipline and think more broadly about how we can connect the dots conceptually in our own heads, and not just from one perspective, so that not everything looks to you like a medical problem. Sometimes it's a political problem, or a sociological problem, et cetera, et cetera. I would say, Ron, back to the policing question, sometimes that's a conversation you just don't want to have. Because sometimes you're having a conversation with somebody who's actually obdurately unwilling to see what's patently obvious. And from the frustration I heard in the question, I think maybe you've had a couple of these conversations, people who just don't want to be convinced that there is such a thing as police brutality. If they need historical background, I'm sorry?
You didn't? No.
Okay, all right, maybe I was just projecting then. You're younger than I am, give it some years. You might have some more of those frustrated kind of, I hope you don't though. But I would say that Khalil Muhammad's book, Condemnation of Blackness, is a good historical background for that. For the modern period, one of my favorite books is Jonathan Simon's Governing Through Crime. Gives a good background for that as well. If you don't feel like having that conversation with your friend or whoever it was, just give them a reading list, give them the syllabus, and that'll be it. I think I answered like 1.5.
So I think about the syllabus, and this is, I know, something that Sam does in his class. He has them go out and do stuff in the community, and so do I. And I think that kind of integration of what you learn in the classroom and actually just going out and engaging with communities who are impacted by racism, by poverty, that changes your perspective. Certainly, the built environment is really important, and that in kind of thinking about the ways in which I've learned an awful lot from Laura Corrigan in GSAP about she's a professor who came up with the $1 Million Block, about not just architecture, but the way in which architects think about how space is used. And that's got me, that was something that pushed me far along in my thinking about the way in which the criminal justice system penetrates communities and doesn't penetrate other communities.
In social work, we now have a mandatory course for all of our first-year students called Decolonizing Social Work, Power, Racism, Oppression, and Privilege, that they all have to take. And we're now trying to suffuse that into the other courses, where all those courses have an anti-Black racism, anti-racism, anti-oppressive lens in every course that they take. Now, this is a massive undertaking, but we're really trying to reimagine our curriculum as a whole, and it started with this one mandatory course. We expect people to have an educated opinion about racism and have an educated opinion about what anti-racism means. You don't just get to say, I don't believe it. That's not an educated opinion, right? And so it's something, you don't have to agree with anything, but you have to have an opinion that's informed by the coursework. Related to the built environment, I'm not sure if you're familiar with an organization called Black Space. Black Space NYC, and then there's the Black in Design Conference at Harvard. And Black Space has this Black Space manifesto that talks about how we might reimagine community and connections in the built environment that I think is really powerful. Architects and urban planners thinking through that, which I think should have implications for how all of us think about space and community. It certainly informs some of my thinking. And then to the last question, the area of health communications is where I see, I would like to see more people thinking about how to leverage the tools of media and narrative and framing to think about issues of race and racism and how we effectively communicate some of these issues. It's a space that I've started to go into more, really trying to understand theories of narrative and using narrative as activism and story as activism. And I think that has implications for health, and it has implications for these broader framing and narratives that we're trying to develop. How do you get more people to get it and understand? And how do you leverage tools people have been using for centuries to think about how to better do that, be more effective?
And I want to share a very quick story of a case I once worked on that picks up on some of these questions we're talking about. It was actually one of my very first cases, which was a class action. It was my lead counsel was Terry McGovern, who's chairs a department here at Mailman. And we were suing the Centers for Disease, we were suing on behalf of women, and it was mostly low-income women of color who had AIDS, and their symptoms had not been picked up in the Centers for Disease Control's definition of AIDS, which was the definition that was relied upon by the Social Security Administration for giving benefits, disability benefits under Social Security. And so the reason I mention this story is that you can see that a question that wasn't asked by the Centers for Disease Control about, well, what does AIDS look like in women, and in particular in low-income women of color, right? Gay men are not getting pelvic inflammatory disease, so that wasn't on the list. How does that then translate into agency policy, which affects the distribution of benefits, which affects then the kinds of long-term and short-term expectations for life? So going back to my point about complexity theory, and I'll just share one other thought. There's a woman named Simi Linton wrote a book called My Body Politic about her experience after having a traumatic accident and losing the use of her legs. And so she asks this question, I'm outside of a building and I can't get in. Should I call a doctor or a lawyer? And so the question really prompts, I think, is a reminder, right, that what we have didn't come from nowhere, right? There's a history to everything we have. There's a history to, in her case, why nobody sort of bothered to stop and ask the question, should there be a step into this building, or should anybody be able to roll in? And likewise, going back to where we started, there's a very long history in the United States, right? 400 years plus since the first enslaved person arrived here. And when we ask, what are the kinds of questions we even think about asking, and how do we approach them? And how do we start to make dents through various ways, knowing each of us can only do our piece? What are the ways in which we figure out what those pieces are, and how do we make those dents? So I especially appreciate all of you coming here today to hear multiple perspectives on how we think about making these changes. And I'd ask you to join me in thanking our panelists. And actually, before I do that, I want to just ask you again to go back to the Legacies of 1619 page on University Life site. If you see resources you think should be there, let us know. And look out always for the University Life newsletter on Tuesdays in your inbox. This Friday at 10 a.m., we have our University Life Task Force on Inclusion and Belonging at Columbia. And Michelle Rosal, who is waving in the back of the room, is our Associate Vice President for Student Life. She convenes the task force. You can go and ask her about it and find more information on University Life's website. We welcome everybody from Columbia. And now I would like you to join me in thanking our really wonderful panelists.